Okay, great. We're going to start the next session of the Policy Talks discussion. I'm really pleased today, or in this session, to be talking about design for recyclability, defining recyclability. All of these things are super important as we look to get more material collected, sorted, and back into the circular economy. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Dave Clark, who's the VP of Sustainability at Amcor, and Thomas Brooks, who's Chief Technology Officer at BHS Bulk Handling Systems. So I'm just going to hand it over to each of you two just to introduce yourselves and the companies you work for and a little bit about what you're doing really in the design for recyclability space. Tom?
Sure, I'm happy to start off. I work for Bulk Handling Systems. Our core approach is recycling equipment, recycling facilities, really kind of taking a holistic approach. As far as our design for recyclability, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit later, but our focus is really trying to bring in adaptability and looking forward into a lot of different areas, and we collaborate a lot with both packaging manufacturers and as well as other technology providers as well. Been in the industry for about 9 years. I used to consider myself a newcomer, but now I think I'm becoming a little bit longer in the tooth maybe. But anyway, very happy to be here as part of the discussion.
Hi, I'm Dave Clark, the Vice President of Sustainability at Amcor. For those of you who don't know, Amcor is a packaging manufacturer. So we make bottles, jars for food, beverage, home and personal care products, medical, pharmaceutical applications. We also make plastic flexible packaging, paper packaging, and metal packaging. And we've been involved with recycling for quite a while. I joined Amcor 18 years ago, actually managing a recycling plant that was making PET, or rPET, for other Amcor plants. And more recently, trying to look at what does it take to move to the next level in terms of making sure the packaging that we make actually gets collected and we get more recycled material to put back into the packaging. So when we talk about design, Amcor was an original member of the New Plastics Economy Initiative with Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And if you go back 4 or 5 years ago, when we looked at what wasn't working about plastics recycling, the answer was it's really 3 things. About half of all of the packaging that's put in the market today is absolutely recyclable. It's just the economics and the logistics and the quality need to be fixed, and we're working on that. According to the EMF, and the number probably holds true pretty well, about a third of the plastic packaging that's put in the market is just not recyclable, either because it's a material that's not recycled or the design of the package makes it impossible or outrageously expensive to recycle, so it's not worth it. And we need a fundamental redesign of those types of packages. And then there's some percentage of packaging, you can argue about how much, that could go into a reuse model. So we really focused on that part about redesign and said, look, we're making packaging that's fundamentally not going to be recyclable. How do we change that? And that's where we really started leaning in around the global commitment to make packaging recyclable. We've been redesigning new product platforms and trying to make sure that the products that we put in the market ultimately can be collected and recycled and turned into new products again.
And Dave, how difficult is that? Because obviously you're producing packaging for many, many different applications. So can you just talk about how complex that, the design piece is of that design for recyclability?
I mean, it's complex and it's not complex. And when I say that, when we started evaluating which of our packaging is recyclable and which is not, we literally found out we make hundreds of thousands of different SKUs. And everyone was slightly different because there was a different customer and a different application. But when you're working on packaging for certain products, whether it might be meat and cheese in the dairy aisle, or you're working on a hot-filled retort package that has to be put into a package and then essentially cooked in the package, so think tuna fish or wet cat food, something like that. Each of them has different properties that you have to be able to meet in terms of temperature and strength and barrier and those types of things. And it's an opportunity to take a step back and say, okay, how do we design this so that it can be recycled in the polyethylene stream or in the polypropylene stream? And when we take that sort of platform approach, how do we solve a problem for a whole category? It becomes a little bit easier.
And do you think that some of your customers have kind of recognise the fact that actually there needs to be more alignment, I suppose, on packaging design, so that there's not that over-engineering or specificity for that client?
I think yes, and I would define it as alignment within certain boundaries. Yes. We can make it anywhere within here, and the recyclers have said if we're in this zone, then they can accept it and recycle it. Now, someone might want their package a little bit heavier and give them better shelf life. Someone might need some other characteristic. But as long as the recyclers essentially say, hey, we can handle this. That doesn't have to be all exactly the same. It's just we've narrowed the sort of range of different materials and processes that we use to make that packaging.
And how important has it been for you to kind of liaise with organisations like BHS and other organisations like TRP, for instance, to help you understand a little bit better the systems? And
it's absolutely required, because if we're going to have a system that works in the future, we have to start with this packaging on one side. It's the things that we all buy in the grocery store and people out all over are buying. And then we have to look at the recycling systems on the other side and figure out how do we get the two to meet in the middle. And that only happens through a lot of dialogue and discussion. So working with organizations like APR in the United States, the Association for Plastics Recyclers, PRE in Europe, Forever Green, because don't forget about paper. Paper, as more companies move toward paper packaging because they think it's greener than plastic packaging, I'm worried we're going to see a lot more non-recyclable paper packaging being put into the market, and we need to make sure we don't do that too. So it's incredibly important that groups work together, come up with one sort of standard, and then find ways to work within that standard and agree on what they are.
yeah, I think Thomas, and obviously for that process, there needs to be that two-way conversation, but there also needs to be some data, right? So maybe you can talk a little bit about how what you're doing is, helping us collect better data to make those informed decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a couple pieces to it, and especially when we look at recyclability, and then when we look at our technology growth and our portfolios. I mean, really, it's part of that discussion back and forth, as David highlighted about. How do we make the broadest swim lane, so to speak, for recyclability to fit into that, for package designers to fit into that? But then also on the backside is being able to design adaptability into systems and be able to do that, as well as the data that's coming forward. Because I think one of the things that we're seeing through the pro organizations that are part of all of the EPR and everything else that we have growing is really how do we make meaningful KPIs out of entire systems? And I think part of that has to be coming out of what's going into the streams, what are coming out of the streams, and then providing a kind of a real-world feedback loop to go forward. And if you look at kind of our technology portfolio and how we've grown that over the past 5 years or so, it's been focused on those pieces, mostly because we know that's going to be the need for growth and how that we solve this problem from kind of all the different angles. And that's going to be an important piece. It's going to lead to success, right, as we carry it forward.
Yeah, I mean, I know you've got some kind of exciting, kind of smaller scale technologies that can work in kind of rural communities a little bit, like that you talked about that adaptability, and like how your system can allow for materials to pass through that several times and collect data. Can you just talk a little bit around that kind of unique kind of offer that you have?
Yeah, so that model is really meant to, I mean, if you look at, especially when you talk about some of the statistics that David brought up about recyclability and what's actually being recovered in the streams today, if we look at kind of the nationwide recyclability of what's actually being recovered, you remove California from it, it's roughly 7 to 9%, which is extremely low. And so part of our vantage point is if we build small systems with tight CapEx, tight OpEx, with a lot of flexibility into it, then it starts to open up the door, again, trying to enlarge those swim lanes for packaging manufacturers and designers to have room to really put something together that meets kind of the customer requirements as well as has a really high recyclability factor. And so that's the reason we kind of designed that system to build just huge amounts of flexibility. And again, something coming out of that system is just this data, this influx of data, because it's just so meaningful for us to make real decisions with, right?
Yeah, cool. Well, this is obviously the policy stage, so we'll bring this back to policy a little bit. So, so we're now seeing through some of the EPR discussions, I suppose, states and maybe the PROs starting to define what the list of recyclable materials are, okay? So I won't say anymore. Maybe, Dave, you could just give a few thoughts on this kind of process that we're going through on defining recyclability and some of the challenges and kind of obstacles we're putting in front of ourselves a little bit maybe on this.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. When we look at what makes something recyclable, and you can look all around the world, any place that something is recycled in practice and at scale, there's a way to sort it into a specific type of commodity that goes into what people in recycling call a stream, and then there's a market for that. Somebody's willing to buy it, and it has enough value that they'll turn it into something else. So fundamentally, when someone says something's not recyclable, it means that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And it may exist because the product or the package is fundamentally not able to do that. It may not exist for a whole bunch of other reasons, like nobody ever invested or nobody ever tried. And one of the things that really scares me is that we may be deciding what's recyclable and what's not for the next couple of generations in the future based on what our grandparents could recycle in the 1980s, because that's what the MRF was designed around. And I think like I said before, we have to really think about how we meet in the middle and decide, what do we want the future to look like? What do we think is going to be sold in the stores? How do we design a system that's flexible enough that it can adapt? And how do we transition a lot of the high-value materials that are fundamentally recyclable today into a system that actually works? And we're seeing that happen in Europe. We're seeing it happen in some places, but not so much in the United States. And that really scares me, that I think we need to be thinking a lot more into the future about how we do this. And I sat in a talk earlier this morning with Tam Sonetafa. She's not here right now. But she said, I worked back in the 1980s before people recycled HDPE, and we established the market for HDPE. We did the same for PET back in the 1980s. Before that, people didn't recycle it. So we can do the same for PE film. We can do the same for PP film and other things that are fundamentally recyclable, and it just isn't done today for a whole lot of reasons.
Yeah, I think obviously, sometimes it's like the chicken and the egg, like you're designing packaging to be recyclable. Your clients, brands are like hoping to use that packaging, but then ultimately if it doesn't get recycled, it's just kind of disheartening for everyone that's invested. So how do you see EPR helping to facilitate the investment that's needed? Both of you, I think this is a question for both of you.
Yeah, well, I think from that standpoint, I mean, if you look at the general intent, I think everybody agrees that that's a positive direction to go. I think so many times though there's a nudging that has to happen there, and I think putting those policies into place really start to drive the core investment that's needed to creating kind of the three legs that are really to be effective at a recycling program or to see recovery or to drive circularity. You've got to have those markets. You've got to be able to recover it. You've got to have what's going into it. That's going to be the piece that really kind of pushes it over the edge and drives it in that direction. And the two examples that Dave gave earlier are good points to that. Is we've had successful roll-in of other plastics and other materials that we've driven to recyclability. They've had to have policy and other pieces to push us in that direction. I think it's a continuation. It's simple. It's simple, but it's not easy a lot of times, right?
Yeah.
So I think EPR gives us two opportunities. One for a product that's not recycled today. The fee should cover the cost of whatever it costs to collect that material, less the value of it in the marketplace. So businesses are incentivized to find ways to collect it very efficiently and help create markets for it. So ideally, over time, we can make them work because the right incentives are in place. The other thing that it does, if you look at EPR fees, is it should incentivize packaging that's easier to recycle and better designed. So over time, it should nudge brand owners and product managers and others to start using better packaging that recyclers want even more. So it should be a win-win in a well-designed system.
Yeah, and I think some of the challenges of setting, I think sometimes we get a bit hung up on what is recyclable and then what might be able to be collected at the curb at a point in time. So I think it's that evolution as well. It's like, okay, we might start a program where we're going to collect a suite of packaging, but that doesn't mean that some of these others aren't recyclable at this time, but we just need to make sure that there's the investment over time to enable them to be brought into the curbside or to the drop-off programs so that we can get that, those systems working. I think what are some of the other challenges, I suppose, in terms of how you define the recyclability piece or set that recyclable list of materials and who sets it?
Well, I think there are two levels for us. One is general recyclability guidelines. So I mentioned the APR, the PRE. The Consumer Goods Forum has developed what they've called their golden design rules now, which companies are signing up to incentivize their designers to design for recyclability. And we're seeing some really good progress there. That's kind of high level. And then at the individual package level, we can work with groups. Again, the Association of Plastics Recyclers has their critical guidance testing that we can do, or the Recyclability in Europe, where we can actually do testing of a specific package to verify that it can be sorted, it can be recycled, and work. So we work at all those different levels to make sure that we are working within the right system.
Yeah. Okay. And then I think the other area that I think this obviously plays into is like when we talk about rates, recycling rates, right? And kind of limited the amount of packaging that can be collected or is deemed recyclable effectively has an impact on what recycling rates we might be able to get to, right? So we kind of really need to think about where we want to go, what recycling rate we might want to achieve, and therefore how packaging has to evolve to enable us to meet that. Yeah.
I'm going to say something really scary here, and I'm happy to argue with people afterwards, but I don't know of any country in the world that is doing single-stream curbside recycling that hits high recycling rates. And if you look at the countries around the world that have much higher recycling rates than the U.S., they all do a lot more source separation. So I'm really worried that if we hook our wagon to curbside recycling, because that's what we've been sold, that we're going to have a real hard time hitting the rates that are being mandated under a lot of EPR programs. So that's one of the things that I lose sleep over at night.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on the same page with you. I think, yeah, we need to keep quality and we need to think about how materials are segregated. Obviously, there's always going to be a role for sorting facilities, but yeah, I don't know if you can talk a little bit.
Yeah, but I think that's a good point in maybe today's date. But I also think that we've got to make sure we're keeping an eye on how do we drive those recycling rates. I think when you talk about driving source separation, even in where we are today, and some of the other, even in the U.S., I think you're struggling to see that resonate with people. And I think that's one of the hardest parts is when you start to talk to companies who are looking for rPET portions of that material stream, they can't get enough of it. And so part of that has to do with an incentivization that goes in. But I think there's also got to be an ability to sort that out of the core waste stream. And I think that's where technology, we're going to see the greatest growth in technology going into that space, because you've got to be able to do that. I think we're going to struggle to see that even in Europe and places that do have higher recycling rates. We know that that's a struggle, and that's a direction that not everybody's pushing towards, right? And I think that's the societal piece we've got to make sure we keep in mind. And how do we drive circularity, right? So.
Cool. Okay, well, we've not got too much time, so I was just going to see if there's anyone in the audience that has a question for Dave or Thomas on this piece.
Thank you for the discussion. Tom, I know we've been working on this topic, but wanted to get your opinion from a policy side. So we've worked together on sortation and how you design how you design packaging to be recycled with our current sortation infrastructure. How do you see policy or even like industry cooperation shaping in the future with the tough issue that depending on what infrastructure you invest in, you might see different results? I think it's an issue where it's like we don't want to stop your company's competitive advantage from like, if you say you're the best sorter, have the best sorters out there, we don't want to limit that. But what does that do for people with other sortation equipment that might not be able to do it the same?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think one of the things that we see within just the recycling space, or you talk about material recovery facilities in general, is I effectively came from a different space where standardization and industrialization was really the focal point. If you look at what's going on today in recycling and facilities, it's a little bit of the Wild West. There's all kinds of different approaches and thoughts on exactly how to do that. What I do see coming forward, though, is I'll see start to maybe a point or a quickening that's going to start to happen around certain technologies that are going to be able to be very adaptive, and those are going to be the ones that are going to drive towards a common point. That's going to come from a number of manufacturers. I should tell you that it's only going to come from one, but that's not going to be the case. There's going to be some others out there. It's going to be the question of who gets there first and who can kind of drive that to an effective point. I think it's also from a designer, from a provider standpoint, it's going to be important for us as we look at the greater good to make sure we're doing things that can be installed in other locations and make that in such a way that it is achievable from a capital model. Because that's going to be, what David made the point very well is the fact that one of the pieces that drives recyclability is to be able to be profitable, and you've got to be able to offset that some way. So I think that, long answer to a very short question is the fact that I think you'll see kind of more of a driving towards standardization of those pieces of equipment and facilities. You also got to see a huge amount of investment that's going to have to take place. We have a lot of very aged infrastructure, especially around recycling. So we almost need this, industrial revolution to hit that space. and we will over the course of the next years, driven by policy and investment. We already see that huge coming out of municipalities who have said, you know what, enough's enough. We're going to have to invest. You know, our population is not supporting kind of a source-separated model. We need to do something more, and so that's where policy is going to start to have a big play into that. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much, both of you, for joining the panel today. It's been a great discussion, so thanks for your time.